Good evening, and that was Peter Dutton delivering his budget reply speech, his vision for the nation if he becomes Prime Minister. Some major announcements there, and it sets the stage for one high-stakes political battle. The Prime Minister is now set to visit the Governor-General at Yarralumla tomorrow morning, and we'll have full coverage of this speech and the political contest on the show tonight. Now, this is a battle between Albanese promising tax cuts worth $5 a week from next July and Peter Dutton pledging $14 a week off your petrol prices. This is the battlefield. Now, there were four big policies unveiled by Peter Dutton in his budget reply speech just now. Firstly, he said he'd introduce legislation to lower energy prices, then laws that would lower immigration and build more homes for Australians. He'd have the Keeping Australians Safe bill, that's national security, and guaranteed funding for health, education and essential services. Now, we're going to go through some of these big announcements, and I'm going to have full coverage on the show tonight. Ross Greenwood and Tom Connell standing by, Bronwyn Bishop too. Now, on energy, Peter Dutton announced a national gas plan. This was a big announcement tonight. He said Australians are paying some of the highest power prices in the world. Now, we already know about his nuclear policy, but here Dutton just spoke about gas, and he said it's key to keeping the lights on. Australia has an abundant supply of natural gas, and he wants to ramp up domestic gas production. He spoke about fast-tracking projects that are ready to go, halving approval times, and defunding the activist-led Environmental Defenders Office. He's also going to invest in critical gas infrastructure to increase the gas pipeline and storage capacity. Have a look.
This plan will prioritise domestic gas supply, address shortfalls and reduce energy prices for Australians. This is all about ensuring Australian gas is for Australians. Yeah. We will immediately introduce an East Coast gas reservation. Yeah. This will require a proportion between 50 to 100 petajoules of spot cargo exports to be delivered to the domestic market. This will secure an additional 10 to 20% of the East Coast demand, gas which would otherwise be exported for use in other markets by consumers in those countries. But our gas needs to be first and foremost for our people. Yeah.
And Dutton claimed that would be a saving of around $263 billion. Now, immigration, this was a big area for the opposition leader. He's tonight linked housing with immigration. He outlined the problem. It's one you all know about, that Albanese has run a big Australia program with 1 million new migrants in his first 2 years in office. But then Labor failed to build a single new house under its $10 billion housing fund. Well, tonight, Dutton has said that he'd cut the permanent migration program by 25%. Now, he didn't put a figure in his speech, but he has previously said that he'd bring down net overseas migration to 160,000 a year. This compares to Labor's figure, which is currently at 335,000 a year. Now, on housing, Dutton said that first home buyers will be able to access up to $50,000 from their superannuation for a home deposit. This is already a highly popular policy with young voters. Now, he also spoke other areas, health, about incentivising junior doctors to work as GPs to address the shortage. He announced an extra $400 million for youth mental health services. Now, on Tuesday night, we didn't hear Treasurer Jim Chalmers focus on defence or national security issues like anti-Semitism in his budget speech. Now, this shows the different priorities from Labor to the coalition, because Dutton just now spoke very strongly about funding and strengthening national security. Now, here, when he speaks about crime, national security and anti-Semitism, this was one of the strongest parts of his speech.
During my travels across the country, Australians tell me they've never been more worried about crime and division in our community. It started with the Prime Minister's Voice referendum, which sought to divide our country by ancestry and race. He then left a vacuum of leadership following the crime wave in Alice Springs and the anti-Semitism on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. All too often, the Prime Minister is too weak, too late and too equivocal. This government has released 300 hardcore criminals from immigration detention into the community, with more than a third having reoffended against Australian citizens. It granted tourist visas to 3,000 people from a terrorist-controlled war zone conducted without security checks that should have been put in place. It's failed to deter people smugglers trying to reach our shores by illegal boats. It's turned a blind eye when our military personnel have been endangered. And it didn't stand up for our country when Chinese communist warships entered our waters without notice.
Now, Dutton is right to focus on crime and this sense of insecurity because too many Australians are worried about life at the moment, whether it's youth crime in Queensland, home invasions in Melbourne, anti-Semitism in Melbourne and Sydney, or the crime wave in Alice Springs. This is a major issue for many voters. Now, Dutton also spoke about what he called moral political leadership that he said he'd provide, and he says this is necessary to restore law and order. We also heard him speak about strengthening bail laws to stop domestic violence offenders, having national knife crime laws, stopping the boats, and got a very popular reaction from his colleagues, deporting criminals who aren't Australian citizens. And he also spoke about one of the outcomes from our Sky News Anti-Semitism Summit.
We will establish a dedicated anti-Semitism task force to turn the tide of this scourge of hatred.
Of course, that's incredibly welcome news. Then on defence, he said he will invest significant funding. He said it would be an election announcement to come over the coming weeks, and he didn't make that there this evening. Now, Dutton also painted the picture of the future he'd deliver for Australia, and he explained how difficult life has been for voters, particularly with the cost of living crisis. He said that rents are up 18% under the Albanese government, housing up 14%, groceries up 30%, electricity up 32%, insurance up 35%. And he promised that he'd be able to bring this all down as he tackles inflation. He also committed to making some savings in the budget. He said he would scrap the $20 billion Rewiring the Nation Fund, the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund that hasn't built a single home. He said he'd get rid of the $16 billion of production tax credits for green hydrogen and critical minerals. He'd also make $7 billion in savings from axing 41,000, he says, Canberra-based public servants that have been hired under the Labor government. Now, Dutton argued that this election is critical for the future of Australia.
But this election does matter more than others in recent history. It is a sliding doors moment for our nation. A returned Albanese government in any form won't just be another 3 bleak years. More economic mistakes will take a lot longer to recover from. Setbacks will be set in stone and our prosperity will be damaged for decades to come. But you have the power to change the path our country is on. You have the ability to reverse decline, and you have the opportunity to get our country back on track.
Now, as I said, the Prime Minister is set to visit the Governor-General in the morning and call the election. Now, we know that one of the biggest battles in this campaign will be Dutton's fuel excise versus Albanese's coffee shop tax cut. Now, the fuel excise has been subject, I can tell you now, it has been subject to focus group research. The Liberals have tested this significantly, extensively before announcing it. And it's very popular in the outer suburban areas, the seats that the coalition needs to win. It's not as popular in the inner city metropolitan areas. Now, this is, in my view, high risk for the coalition to oppose tax cuts in an election campaign. No question, this is a high-risk strategy that has shocked many on both sides of politics today. But Peter Dutton is confident he'll be able to convince voters that his petrol price relief is worth more than the $5 tax cut that comes into effect in 15 months' time. Now, Dutton's policy means paying around $14 less in petrol a week based on a 55-litre tank. Now, he sharpened his key attack over this in Question Time today.
The Prime Minister has caused a lot of pain to Australian families over the last 3 years. will the Prime Minister join with me in cutting the price of petrol and diesel to save tradies, pensioners and families up to $28 a week instead of his 70-cent a day tax cut, which doesn't even come in for 15 months?
Now, Albanese would usually allow a week for his budget to be sold across the country, but the headlines have been mostly negative, focusing on the decade of deficits, $1 trillion in debt, and a tax cut the size of a cup of coffee. So this time tomorrow, we will be in an election campaign. And at this point, either side can win. Dutton is strengthening his position in suburban areas, while Labor's vote has cemented in the metropolitan areas. This election is genuinely up for grabs right now, despite what the polls say. The battle will be intense, the spin will be excruciating, and we'll be here every night to call it out.